Good morning. Welcome everybody. We're starting Rambam. Mishneh Torah Rambam, Maimonides' magnum opus. His book, or his set of 14 books that covers the entirety of Jewish law and all of the 613 mitzvahs. The Rebbe in 1984 initiated a campaign that every single Jew should study the entire Rambam, to familiarize himself, to gain a knowledge, b'chol Torah kula, in the entire Torah. And he said that there's two tracks. You can either learn the Rambam 3 chapters a day, finishing it in 1 year, or 1 chapter a day, finishing it in 3 years. We're choosing the 1 chapter a day track. And as the Rebbe taught us, we begin with the introduction, because unlike other books where the introduction is just that, an introduction, but the Rambam, the principles that he lays down in this Hakdama, in this introduction, actually serve to help us understand. They're a guide to many of the principles that he's going to reveal to us throughout this book. In other words, only by truly understanding that which the Rambam transmits to us in this Hakdama can we fully appreciate what he's giving us in the book of the Rambam. So we begin, and Bezrat Hashem should only help us that we see this project through from the beginning to the end, starting in the beginning of the introduction and concluding with the halachas of Mashiach as the Rambam does his book. We're going to be using the Moznayim Rambam. That's the Rambam that has the Hebrew and the English as well. If you're following along in another Rambam, I see Amnon has a different print. You'll notice that there's a couple of different variants and subtle changes in the text, but it's no real big deal. But that's just the book that we're going to be using. And actually, the Rebbe points out that the Rambam begins with the words B'Shem Hashem Kel Olam, in the name of God. Like today, many of us write on top of pages Baruch Hashem when we begin a letter. The Rambam also begins his book with those words, in the name of God, the Master of the world. I see it doesn't appear in the Moznayim Rambam, but nevertheless in many handwritten manuscripts of the Rambam we have those words, and the Rebbe explains that that's because the Rambam is letting us know that it's not his own handiwork, it's not his own genius that let him create this wonderful work, but instead it's Hashem's help. And with that we begin. Hakdamas HaRambam Zal, the introduction of the Rambam. As he does every one of the 14 books, he quotes a verse from the prophets or from the writings from Nevi'im Uktuvim as an introduction to his book. And in this case, it's a verse from Psalms, from Tehillim. Ozloi Eivesh Bahabiti El Kol Mitzvaysecha. Then, says David HaMelech, I will not be embarrassed when I look at all of your mitzvahs. Why does the Rambam choose this verse? Because that's the purpose of his book. He wants to give us a look at all of the 613 mitzvahs. And then a Jew can proudly declare, Lo Evosh, I'm not embarrassed. So long as we don't have a basic knowledge in every area of our Torah, we're a little bit embarrassed. We can't fulfill our divine mission as representatives of Hashem if we don't know every part of the Torah. But B'habiti al kol mitzvasecha, when I look at all of the mitzvahs, then I will not be embarrassed. And the Rambam boldly sets out this mission statement that he is going to give each and every one of us a handle, a way to access the entire Torah by learning the basic information about all of the 613 mitzvahs. Now the Rambam begins his introduction, and as I mentioned before, the introduction serves as a springboard to this wonderful work. The Rambam was the first person in history to codify all of Jewish law. Until then, you had to be a huge genius, as the Rambam will later tell us in his introduction. We'll learn about it on Tuesday. How, if you wanted to understand the laws of Shabbat, you would think, just open up Tractate Shabbat, Masechet Shabbat, and the Gemara, and you'll have everything. But no, first of all, you'll be exposed to hundreds of other unrelated discussions, nothing to do with Shabbos, and as well, you won't get the full gamut of Shabbos until you open up almost every other tractate to learn the small bits and pieces that are related to the laws of Shabbos. The Rambam took from the entire Gemara and all of the other works that were created at that time, halachic works, and from the totality of that, codified all of the law into an organized fashion, so that when you open up the Rambam's laws of Shabbat, you can be certain that in those 30 chapters, you're going to get everything that you need to know about Shabbat. And that was an incredible, incredible revolution in Jewish literature of the time. It didn't exist until then. And the Rambam wants to let us know how Torah evolved in this way to the point where the Rambam was required to make this work. And what he does is he walks us through how Torah was built. Torah was handed down. I'm going to give it to you in a nutshell right now, then we're going to go through the text inside. Torah was given in 2 parts, a written Torah and an oral Torah. The Torah that we have right here in the Aron Kodesh that we read from every Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat, that's called the written Torah. Then we have Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the oral explanation of the Torah, because the Torah is very cryptic. If you read the words, we have a famous verse, Ukshartam le'ot al yadecha. That's the verse about tefillin. You're supposed to tie them as a sign over your hands. What do we tie? How do we tie? How should tefillin look? We have no idea. You read the entire Torah, you won't find anything about that. You have to have the oral Torah, which gives us the tradition as to how the Torah Shebiktav, the written Torah, is supposed to be fulfilled. And that is how Hashem wanted it. He wanted a written Torah, shorthand, and an oral Torah that should be the explanation of the written Torah to be passed down from teacher to student as an oral tradition, ba'al peh, by heart, not to be written down ever. That was the original intent. And that's how it went, from student to teacher to student to teacher to student. The Rambam delineates 40 generations of direct, unbroken tradition that the Torah was handed down. And then later on, as Jewish history evolved and Jews were being persecuted and they were being forced into exile, and there were reason to assume that the proper oral Torah would not be able to be preserved without it being written down, that's when the first elements of the oral Torah were written down. Rabbeinu HaKadosh wrote down the Mishnah, later on the Midrash, later on the Tosefta, later on the Talmud, and finally we come to the Rambam, as the Rambam will delineate in his introduction. So basically, this work of the Rambam is the sum total of all of the oral Torah that had been existing up until the time of the Rambam. Without further ado, let's see it inside. All the mitzvahs that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai were given along with their explanation, i.e. the oral Torah. Shenemar, as the verse states, when Hashem was first giving Moshe the Torah, he said to him, I'm going to give you the luchot, the tablets of stone, and the Torah and the mitzvah. What are these two expressions, the Torah and the mitzvah? Moses got the tablets, plus the Torah and the mitzvah. Torah, says the Rambam, zu Torah shebichsav, that's the written Torah. The mitzvah, zu pirusha, that's the explanation. In other words, how to fulfill the Torah. Vitzivanu, Hashem commanded us at that moment, la'asais haTorah al pi mitzvah, that we're going to have a written Torah. But if you just read the written Torah, you won't know how to fulfill it. You have to fulfill the Torah based on the mitzvah, based on the expounding and the elucidation that the oral tradition offers us. This mitzvah, the totality of the oral tradition, is called the Torah of Ba'al Peh, which means by heart, because it was meant to be passed down without being written. And the Rambam gives us some background information. Kol HaTorah, the written Torah. Kasva Moshe Rabbeinu Kedem Sheyamos B'Ksav Yadeh. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote before his passing in his own hand. The Nasan Sefer L'Chol Shevet V'Shevet. He made 13 copies of this written Torah. He gave one copy to each tribe. The Sefer Echad Nasno Ba'arin Le'ed. And one more additional Torah he put into the Aron, the Holy Ark, as a forever testimony. Shenemar, as the verse says towards the very end of the Torah, L'Koyach HaSefer HaTorah Hazeh V'Samtem Oisei. Take this Torah and put it right inside or beside the Aron HaKodesh. The mitzvah and the oral law, shehi pirush HaTorah, the explanation of the written Torah, loy kasva, he never wrote it down, aletziva ba liskenim v'liyahishua v'lishar kol Yisrael. Rather, he commanded it, i.e. he transmitted it to the 70 elders, Yehoshua, who was his primary student, and the rest of the Jews together. Moshe Rabbeinu sat and taught Torah for 40 years. That was his job. And he taught it all orally. Shenemar, as the verse states, Eis kol hadavar asher anochi mitzave eschem oisei sishmiru lases v'gemer. The entirety of the thing that I am commanding you, in other words, that Moshe is giving over, you should guard to do it. That will be the way you will know what to do, by listening to that which I am teaching you. And because of this, because it was only given over orally, it's called Torah Sheba'al Peh, because it was the oral Torah, literally. However, says the Rambam, Moshe Rabbeinu made it a point to really teach this oral Torah. Even though it was not written down, this oral Torah, Limda Moshe Rabbeinu Kula bebeis dine l'shivim zekenim. Moshe Rabbeinu taught the entirety of it. He didn't leave one iota out to his Beis Din, to his court, 70, made up of 70 elders. And there were 3 people that stood out from among all of the other students that Moshe had. They were the primary recipients of the oral Torah. That was Elazar, Aaron the high priest's son; Pinchas, that was Elazar's son, he was the next Cohen in line; the Yehoshua, and Yehoshua, who was the primary student. The 3 of them received from Moshe. However, while all 3 of them were really high-level students, the Yehoshua, Shehu Talmidei Shel Moshe Rabbeinu, page 19, Yehoshua, who is the student of Moshe, the direct student, Masar Torah Sheba'al Peh v'tzivo aleh. To him, Moshe Rabbeinu gave over the rights of the Oral Torah, and he commanded him over it. In other words, Moshe taught the entirety of the Oral Torah to everybody, but there was one person who became the unique agent of transmission for the future. Yehoshua was appointed as the one who would be responsible for continuing the chain of unbroken tradition to the next generation. Yehoshua indeed fulfilled this commandment. He taught his entire life by heart, orally, and many elders received from Yehoshua. Just like Moshe had many students, Yehoshua had many students. However, there was one, again, person that was chosen to be the primary agent of transmitting the Torah, and in this case, that was Eli, the Kohen Gadol. Eli is well known from the prophets. He served as the high priest in the Mishkan in Israel before the temple was built. When the Jews came to Israel, they didn't have right away the Holy Temple. They had first a Mishkan in different places, in Gilgal, and Nov, and Givon, and Shiloh, as we'll actually learn about later on in the Rambam's book, number 8, the book about the Beis HaMikdash. And so Eli was this personality, and besides for serving as high priest, he was also responsible for the transmission of the Torah. He received the tradition from the Zekanim, from those elders who got it from Yehoshua, and as well as from Pinchas, who was a kind of a friend, a chaver, on the same level as Yehoshua, having received the Torah directly from Moshe. But in the line of tradition of the Torah, Eli is considered to be the next one. We're going to see later on in the Rambam, he actually considers Pinchas to be a student of Yehoshua. While it's not clear over here you could read it as though Moshe Rabbeinu gave it over to Yehoshua, and Yehoshua gave it over to the Zekanim, who gave it to Eli. Later on, the Rambam will clearly let us know that it was Yehoshua who also became Pinchas' teacher. In other words, part of Moshe Rabbeinu appointing Yehoshua as the primary agent of transmission was that he became the teacher for all those that were around him, including Pinchas. So we have Moshe first, Yehoshua second, and then we have Pinchas, and now Eli is number 4. And now the Rambam continues. Ushmuel kibel me Eli ubeis dinoi. Shmuel, Hanavi, the famous Shmuel the prophet, received the entirety of the Torah from Eli and his high court. Notice how the Rambam each time attaches a high court to the teacher. Moshe had his high court. Yehoshua had his high court. And Eli as well had his high court. And the Rambam explains the reason for that in a letter, not printed in the Rambam's book of Mishneh Torah, but in another letter that he once wrote, he said because the reason that he stressed this point is to underline the fact that Torah was transmitted from a group to a group. No such thing as individual transmission. When you have individual transmission, you run the risk of broken telephone. It was unbroken tradition, preserved in its purest form, because the Torah was passed down from high court to high court, such that any issues that arose, any points of arguments, any points of contention could always be resolved. You never had to be in doubt for a moment because you had a full high court arguing about the text of the Torah, and every issue was resolved. So in this way, Judaism is different from all other religions. All other religions end up with one singular person. And here we have the idea of mass revelation at Sinai, as well as the tradition of being passed down, not just from one teacher to one student, but from multiple people in the Beis Din to multiple Beis Dins. And now the Rambam runs through a number of generations that received the Torah one from each other. Shmuel the prophet from Eli and his Beis Din. David kibel mishmuel Beis Din. David the king, David HaMelech. Besides for being a king, he also functioned as a huge Torah scholar. He received from Shmuel on his high court. Ba'achia HaShilaini, there is a famous character in the Tanakh who's named Achia of Shiloh. Miyotzei Mitzrayim Hoya. According to tradition, he actually was part of the exodus from Egypt. He lived for hundreds of years. The Levi Hoya, he was from the tribe of Levi. V'shama mi Moshe. Essentially, he heard the Torah from Moshe. So he could be reckoned as a direct student from Moshe, second generation. However, says the Rambam, V'hoya katan b'mei Moshe. He was a child in the days of Moshe, therefore he cannot be counted as the next person in line of unbroken tradition. Rather, when he grew up and got much older, he was a receiver from David HaMelech and his high court, and therefore he becomes the next in line. Elijah the prophet, he received the tradition from Achia and his high court. Elisha, who was Eliyahu's primary student, also Again, this point, it's so interesting that you see, we're familiar with these characters from the Tanakh as miracle workers, as leaders, but their primary function, if you think about it in the context of Jewish history, was to hold on to the entirety of the Torah. If not for them, David HaMelech, he was busy fighting so many wars, and yet his primary occupation Torah teaching. Elijah the prophet, we know him from visiting the Seders, visiting brises. That's not who he really was. Who he really was at his core was the transmitter of the Torah. And we continue. Yehoyada HaKohen, Kibel me'Elisha Beis Dino, Yehoyada the high priest. He received from Elisha and his high court. Uzechariah, also another prophet, Kibel miYehoyada Beis Dino, received from Yehoyada and his high court. V'Hosheya, these are all prophets. Kibel miZechariah Beis Dino, he received it from Zechariah and his high court. V'Amos, Kibel meHosheya Beis Dino, he received it from Hosea. V'Yeshaya, this is Isaiah, the famous prophet about Mashiach. He prophesies about many important things. He was Kibel me Amos Beis Dinai. He received it from Amos and his high court. Umicha Kibel me Yeshayo Beis Dinai. Micha the prophet received from Yeshaya and his high court. V'Yoel Kibel me Micho Beis Dinai. Joel the prophet received from Micha and his high court. V'Nachum Kibel me Yoel Beis Dinai. V'Chavako Kibel me Nachum Beis Dinai. Utzfanya Kibel me Chavako Beis Dinai. V'Yirmiyah Jeremiah the prophet Kibel me Tzfanya Beis Dinai. Uvaruch ben Neriah Kibel me Yirmiyah Beis Dinai. And Baruch, the son of Neriah, received from Yirmiyah. A very interesting transition point happens here in Jewish history. These were the last two people, Jeremiah and Baruch, who witnessed the destruction of the first temple. At this point, the Jewish people were exiled to Babylon for 70 years. Baruch ben Neriah took the Torah, the Oral Torah, with him to Babylon and continued teaching there. Ezra, who the Rambam delineates as the next in line, the Ezra Beis Dinai, Kibel mi Baruch ben Neriah Beis Dinai, Ezra and his high court, who received from Baruch and his high court, you have to understand that they partially received the Torah in a state of exile in Babylon. And here, we have a very famous high court. Until now, it was just the main characters that were the star of the show. We don't really know much about the high courts of all the prophets, but we do know a lot about the high court of Ezra because they were super influential in the continuity of Judaism. They functioned partially in Babylon, and they helped bring the Jewish people back to Israel for the building of the Second Temple. Beis Dinai shel Ezra, continues the Rambam. The high court of Ezra, Heman Ikroim Anshe Knesses Hagadela. They are familiar to us as the people, the men of the great assembly. We're learning now in these weeks, Pirkei Avot. Every Shabbos we study one chapter. Last Shabbos we studied the first chapter, not yesterday, I'm talking about a week ago. And there we mentioned the Anshe Knesses Hagadela, the people of the great assembly. They were the ones who were functioning in the high court of Ezra. Among them are some famous personalities. Vehem, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi. Those are considered to be the final prophets. Daniel and his friends, the famous Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who were thrown into the furnace by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Nehemiah ben Chachaliah, as well as the famous Nehemiah, who came to Israel with Ezra together. Mordechai Bilshan, the famous Mordechai from the story of Purim. He's called Mordechai Bilshan, the linguist, because he was familiar in many languages. Zerubbabel, the Harbe Chachamim Imoam, as well as many other sages, Tashlum, for a total of Meya ve'Esrim Zekanim, 120 elders. They comprised the high court of Ezra. Interesting to note, most of the high courts functioned as a group of 71 judges. The high court of Ezra was 120. Ha'acharein mehem, the final one of the Anshe Knesses Hagadela, who Shimon HaTzadik, was named Shimon HaTzadik, who Hoya Miklala Meya ve'Esrim. He was one of the 120. However, he was the last one, and just like we mentioned before about Achia Hashileni, who was small, young in the times of Moshe, and wasn't considered a full recipient till later when he received from David. Same thing with Shimon HaTzadik. He doesn't get reckoned as part of Ezra's high court in the sense of being part of their line of transmission. He became his own because he received from all of the rest of the Anshe Knesses Hagadela. Kibel Torah Shabal Peh Mikulam. He received the oral Torah from them all. V'hu hoya kohen gadol achar Ezra. He was the high priest after Ezra, right in the beginning of the Second Temple times. The Talmud famously relates that when Alexander the Great fought his wars and he finally came to conquer Jerusalem, when he came in, Shimon HaTzadik, who was the high priest, decided then to go greet him, robed in the holy garments of the Kohen Gadol, highly unusual. And when he came out to greet him, Alexander got off of his horse and bowed to him, and he said that whenever he goes to fight a war, the image of a man robed in the Kohanic, in the vestments of the high priest, goes before him and helps him be victorious. And when he saw Shimon HaTzadik, he said, "That's him." He was super impressed, and that helped him in his relationship with the Jewish people. This was Shimon HaTzadik. Again, we find a famous personality who we look to as a leader or a visionary or a Kohen Gadol, but his main function was the receiver of the Torah. He passed on Torah and preserved it for eternity. Antignois, Ish Soiche, continues the Rambam. Antignois, man of Socho, that's where he lived. Ubeis Dinai and his high court. Kiblu Mishimon HaTzadik Ubeis Dinai. We're going to be familiar now with the next couple of paragraphs from Pirkei Avot. Here, Torah transitioned from being exclusively one person. He was the star with his high court. Now we have the period of time known as the Zugot, the pairs, where two people function in tandem as the leaders of the generation. The Talmud elsewhere tells us that one of them functioned as the Nasi, who was the highest level, and the second in command was called the Av Beit Din, the father or the overseer, the one who presided, the president of the Beis Din. These were two who worked in tandem, starting after Antignos. So there was Shimon HaTzadik, Antignos, and now we come to the Zugos on page 21. We turn the page. V'Yosei ben Ye'ezer ish Tzreida, v'Yosef ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim, u'Beis Dinam. Yosei ben Ye'ezer of Tzreida, Yosef ben Yochanan of Yerushalayim, and their high courts together, Kiblu, they received me Antignos u'Beis Dinoi. V'Yehoshua ben Prache, this was the next in line, V'Nitai ha'Arbeli, they functioned together again, another Zug, another pair. Ubeis Dinam and their high court. Kiblu mi Yosef ben Ye'ezer v'Yosef ben Yochanan ubeis Dinam. They received from Yosef ben Ye'ezer and Yosef ben Yochanan and their court. Next we have Yehuda ben Tabai v'Shimon ben Shatach ubeis Dinam. Kiblu mi Yehoshua ben Prachia v'Nitai ha'Arbeli ubeis Dinam. And the Zugais continue, the pairs continue. Shmaya v'Avtalion. The Rambam makes note that they were Geirei HaTzadik, they were converts, righteous converts. Ubeis Dinam. Kiblu mi Yehuda v'Shimon ubeis Dinam. They received from Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shatach and their high court. And it's very interesting because, as I mentioned before, these two, every time there was a pair, one of them functioned as the Nasi, the highest leadership position in the Jewish people. And noting that they were converts actually makes some commentaries wonder, because the Talmud seems to indicate that a ger, a convert, cannot be instated as the Nasi. Nevertheless, the commentaries make the point that the Rambam wants to stress to us that you could have a convert, somebody who joined the Jewish people, he was a guy growing up, and yet he became an integral piece of the chain of our tradition. So even though they were gerim, they were able to achieve such high stature, and they received from Yehuda and Shimon. And the chain continues. Hillel v'Shammai ubeis Dinam, the famous Hillel and Shammai, who led the schools, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the schools of Shammai, the schools of Hillel, they're famous throughout the entire Talmud. They received from Shmaya v'Avtalion, Kiblu, Shmaya v'Avtalion ubeis Dinam, and here Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Shimon ben Ishel Hillel HaZakein, these were the last of the pairs, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Shimon, who was the son of Hillel, Kiblu me Hillel v'Shammai ubeis Dinam. And now we're going to have a very interesting point in the Rambam's introduction. The Rambam's going to kind of split, because here we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Shimon. These were the two last ones of the pair. They each taught to their own sets of students, and we're going to see how Jewish tradition here kind of parted. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had his line, and Rabbi Shimon had his line. In the end, we're going to notice that they came back together. But here the Rambam makes a point to go on each one individually. Chamisha talmidim hoyel Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 students. Fascinatingly, this was yesterday's Pirkei Avot, chapter 2. We learned about the 5 students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai who advised him on a good way and a bad way for humans to live. So he had 5 famous students. They were the greatest of the sages who received from him. In other words, Rambam is making the point again. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai surely taught to much more than 5 people. He had a massive following, but the 5 people who became responsible agents for the transmission of the Torah, the greatest of them all were these 5. Ve'eluhem, Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol, Rabbi Eliezer the Great, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Yossi HaKoyen, Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel, Rabbi Elazar ben Aroch. They were the 5 of the students. And it seems like Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol became the primary transmitter, because the Rambam only continues on his line. Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, the famous Rabbi Akiva who lived towards the end of the Second Temple era, who was the son of Yosef, Kibel mi Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol, he received the tradition from Rabbi Eliezer the Great. And again, the Rambam makes the point, the Yosef aviv ger tzedekaya. Yosef, his father, again, was a ger. Here we see, you can be the children of gerim. Your ancestry can be outside the Jewish people, and you can become a fundamental element in Jewish tradition. Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Meir ben ger tzedek, again the converts mentioned. Kibel mi Rabbi Akiva. So we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai at the top, student Rabbi Eliezer, he taught Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Meir received from Rabbi Akiva. V'gam kibo Rabbi Meir v'chaverav me Rabbi Yishmael. And here we have a first of its kind, an interesting element in the tradition where a friend becomes a teacher. Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Meir were both students of Rabbi Akiva, and in the end, Rabbi Meir also turned to Rabbi Yishmael, his friend, to be his teacher. And Rambam said it was Rabbi Meir and his friends. Who were his friends? Chaverav shel Rabbi Meir. The friends of Rabbi Meir are some of the most recognizable faces from the Mishnah's time. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Nehemiah, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar, Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, Rabbi Chananya ben Trada. And you study the Mishnah, these are stages that get mentioned every other day. Some of them were actually the 10 martyrs that we mentioned on Yom Kippur, who were killed by the Romans. Rabbi Chananya ben Trada and Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, they were brutally killed by the Romans in tyrannical ways, and they are heroes in that way of the Jewish people. But again, their primary focus, teaching Torah. So we have Rabbi Meir and his friends, these were his friends, receiving from Rabbi Yishmael. V'chein kiblu chaveirav shel Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer Gadol. Another Rambam returns, and it says that Rabbi Akiva's friends, besides for Rabbi Akiva receiving from Rabbi Eliezer, his friends also received from Rabbi Eliezer. Who were they? Chaveirav shel Rabbi Akiva, him also some of the famous heroes of the Mishnah, Rabbi Tarfa, and Rabbi, who was the teacher of Rabbi Yossi Lipskier, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And here concludes the chain began by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the last of the pairs. Now we return to Rabbi Shimon, who was the contemporary of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and we follow his line of Torah. And here we're going to have a repeat of a number of names, because it seems like around this time is when the tradition of naming after illustrious grandparents and parents came into public use. So here we have a number of similar names, but each one was a father and a son. Rabban Gamliel Hazakin, Rabbi Gamliel the elder, Kibil me Rabban Shimon Aviv, who was the son of, the Rambam points us back, Benoi Shel Hillel Hazakin. So you had Hillel and Shammai. His son was Rabban Shimon, and his son was Rabban Gamliel. And this is where the line continues from father to son, who were simultaneously teacher and student. Rabban Shimon Benoi, this is now the second Rabban Shimon, received from his father, Kibel Mimenu. That's Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel Benoi, this is Rabban Gamliel the second. Kibel Mimenu received from his father, Rabban Shimon the second. Rabban Shimon Benoi, this is Rabbi Shimon the third now. Kibel Mimenu from his father, Rabban Gamliel the second. For Rabbi Yehuda, and this is the most famous personality that we're going to be focusing in on, Rabbi Yehuda, who was Benoi Shel Rabban Shimon, son of Rabban Shimon the third. Zehu Hanikra Rabbeinu HaKadosh, he is called the Holy Rabbi. Behu Kibel Me Aviv. Umir Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, Umir Rabbi Shimon Chabeirav, he received from many people, from his father Rabbi Shimon, from Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, and here we see the two lines joining again. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua was a student of a student of a student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was a contemporary of Rabbi Shimon. So in the end, while the Torah tradition seems to have split, they came back united in the days of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, who received both from his father and from Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua and Rabbi Shimon, who were all his father's friends. And Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rebbe, known as Rabbi Yehuda the Nasi, Rabbi Yehuda the prince, he created a revolution in the Oral Torah, because until now it was just passed down from teacher to student orally. Rabbeinu HaKadosh would be the first who would commit an element of the Oral Torah to writing in the form of what we know today as the Mishnah. And the Rambam will elaborate on this, as well as explain to us why Rabbeinu HaKadosh saw fit to do so. Says the Rambam, Rabbeinu HaKadosh Chiber HaMishnah. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, he was called the Holy Rabbi. He compiled the Mishnah. From the days of Moshe Rabbeinu until the days of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, nobody had ever compiled a compilation. Nobody had ever created a work that was to be taught publicly about the Oral Torah. Ella, and here the Rambam segues into a very interesting piece of information. While until now I made it sound like the written Torah was written and the oral Torah was completely oral, it's not exactly the case. There were some things, some parts of the Oral Torah that were written down as well, but never publicly. That's the key word. Nobody taught it in public, the Oral Torah. Rather, Ella, says the Rambam, in every generation, Reish Beis Din, the head of the high court, Einavi Shahaya Ba'isei Hador, or the prophet that was in that generation, as we saw before. In the lineage, there were many prophets, and some of them were heads of high courts. Now we're on page 23. Every leader, everybody would write for himself a memorandum, just a memo, shorthand notes of what he heard from his teachers. But the primary leader would teach in public orally. Any person had the right to write for himself according to his capacity, from the explanation of the Torah, from its laws, whatever he heard, you could write down. As well as things that were novelly introduced in every generation, laws that were not learned directly from tradition, rather with one of the 13 principles of hermeneutics that the Torah is allowed to be expounded with, to which the High Court decreed. The Rambam himself talks about this much, much later, towards the very end of his entire work, in the last book, in the section that's called Laws of Mamrim. There, the Rambam tells us a little bit about how the High Court used to function. You see, the written Torah came down, and like I said before, much of it needed explanation. It's very cryptic, and it requires the oral tradition. However, part of the oral tradition is 13 principles by which we can derive new laws as they apply to contemporary times from the original written text. So that what may be the body of Oral Torah in the first generation, 2 generations later, the body of Oral Torah may have grown because the rabbis in their time decided to apply these principles in new ways and derive new laws. So whenever something new was created by which the high court had to agree, because that was an important principle. Not everybody can just use these principles on their own. The high court had to agree. It had to pass, let's call it like today, Congress would have to ratify a new law. So in the same way, the high court had to ratify every time that these 13 principles were used. By the way, these 13 principles are what we talk about every morning before davening. It's a little paragraph that starts off, Rabbi Yishmael Omer. That was Rabbi Yishmael used to say, B'shlosh esrei midot haTorah nidreshet. There are 13 principles by which Torah can be expounded. Those are the 13 principles. We say them every single day. So, if there would have been a new application, any person could write this down, and that would be an element of the Torah Shabbal Peh, of the Oral Torah that was written. In fact, the Talmud many times makes reference to these notes, calling them Megillat Starim, a scroll that was hidden, because they were scrolls written down, but they were always hidden because they were never used, never intended for public use. Continues the Rambam, V'chein hoya hadavar tamid ad Rabbeinu HaKadosh. So the matter remained constantly until the days of Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, the holy Rabbi, Rabbeinu HaKadosh. V'hu, for the first time, he, kibeitz kol hashmues v'chol hadinim v'chol habiyurim v'hapirushim, he gathered all of the traditions and all of the laws and all of the explanations sheshamu miMoshe Rabbeinu, that they had heard all the way dating back to Moses, v'shalamdu bezdin shebechol der v'der b'chol ha'Torah kula, and that the high court in every generation had learned and expounded in the entire Torah. B'chiber mehakel sefer HaMishnah, and he compiled from the totality of it the book that we know today as the Mishnah. He divided it into 6 orders, 63 tractates, and basically it's a shorthand version of the entirety of the Oral Torah. V'shinanei l'chachamim barabim, he taught it to the sages in public. This was the first time there was a text that was going to be used in the Oral Torah. B'nigla l'chol Yisrael, it was revealed to the entirety of the Jewish people. Uksvu kulam, and all of them wrote it down. V'ribtza b'chol makom, they spread it everywhere. Kedei shalei tishtakach Torah Shabbal Peh Yisrael. All this was done so that Torah Shabbal Peh, the Oral Torah, should not be forgotten from the Jewish people. The Lama Asar Rabbeinu HaKadosh Kach. Now why? Why did he do this? Why didn't he leave it as it was? Judaism was going and flourishing for thousands of years, and they never had to write down any part of the Oral Torah. Why did Rabbeinu HaKadosh do this? Lefi, says the Rambam, there was a very important circumstantial change that took place in Jewish history at his point in time. He saw that students with the capacity to retain all of Torah Shabbal Peh were getting less and fewer in number. Plus, troubles were constantly becoming in new ways, new persecution, new ways that the government decided to hound the Jewish people. The Roman kingdom was spreading across the world and was getting stronger, as well as an exile was taking place, whereby Jews were being spread out all over the diaspora to the corners of the world. And therefore he saw this as a major risk to the continuity of Judaism. If Jewish people would be exiled, they wouldn't have the same capacity of retention, and they would constantly be persecuted. This was a recipe to forget the Torah, the Oral Torah, the way it was preserved for all these generations. Therefore, Chiber Chibur Echad Lias Biad Kulam, he compiled one authoritative work to be in the hands of everybody, so they can learn it very fast and it would never be forgotten. It's very important to note that the Mishnah today has been expounded much, much further. Today we have the Talmud, today we have so many other commentaries on the Mishnah. This is because as generations went forward, and as we'll talk about later in the introduction, Jewish wisdom got less and less and progressively less. So we had to come up with more and more commentaries. But ideally, in the Mishnah, you have a shorthand code for all of the Oral Torah. So any student in that time who would read the Mishnah and become fluent in it would essentially thereby be fluent in the entirety of Torah Shabbal Peh, because he would have there cliff notes or pointers that could get him access from there to the entire Torah Shabbal Peh. The Yashav Kol Yamav, concludes the Rambam, he sat all of his days, hu ubeis dina, he and his high court, the limdu ha-mishnah barabim, and they taught the Mishnah in public. The Eluhem, and the Rambam continues listing the lineage of the Torah's tradition. The following are the great sages who were present in the high court of Rabbeinu HaKadosh and received the Torah from him. Again, Rebbe had thousands of students, but there were, as the Rambam will delineate immediately, 11 primary students that he had. By the way, as a parenthetical note, the Talmud actually shows that the concept of writing down the Oral Torah can be ascribed to a verse. The verse in Psalms and Tehillim says, Eis la'asot la'Hashem meferu torasecha. There's a time where in order to do for God's sake, you have to nullify the Torah. And Rabbeinu HaKadosh himself expounded this verse to mean that sometimes you have to disobey and abolish that rule of not writing Torah down for the sake of Hashem's name. And the Rebbe explained once that the reason that the Rambam doesn't make mention of this is because Rambam, he gives us the concept. He doesn't necessarily have to give us the verse, but it is found in a verse. Anyway, at any rate, the Rambam now lists the 11 primary rabbis in Rebbe's high court. They were Shimon ben Gamliel Banav, two of his sons, Shimon and Gamliel. This is now Shimon the fourth, and Gamliel the third. Rabbi Ephes, Rabbi Chanina bar Chama, Rabbi Chia, Rav. He was one of the foremost sages of the Talmud. Rabbi Yanai, Ubar Kapara, Ushmuel. Shmuel was Rav's contemporary. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Hoshaya. Elu hein gedolei hachachamim. Again, the Rambam stresses these are the great sages. Shekiblu mimenu v'imahem alafim or revavos mishar chachamim. But along with them, there were thousands and myriads of other sages. Afal pisha elu ha'achad asar kiblu mirabenu hakadosh v'amdu mimidrasha. And now a similar phenomenon repeats itself. Even though there were 11 of these students, all receiving from Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and they all stood in his academy. Rabbi Yochanan katan hay. Rabbi Yochanan was one of these smaller, younger students. And therefore, he later became a student of one of his own contemporaries. Haya Talmud, Rabbi Yanai, later on he became a student of Rabbi Yanai, Bekibel Mimenu Torah, and received the Torah from him. Bechein Rab, also another one of these 11, Kibel Mi Rabbi Yanai, placed Rabbi Yanai as his teacher and received the Torah from him. Ushmuel, Kibel from another friend, Rabbi Chanina bar Chama, and thereby you had kind of two generations within one, because even though all these sages all received from Rebbe, they all appointed some of their friends to be their teachers as well. And now they followed in the ways of their master. Rabbeinu HaKadosh was the first one who authored a work of the Oral Torah, the Mishnah. Some of his students authored further works that we are very familiar with today. Rav Chiber Sifra v'Sifri. Rav authored the Midrashim known today as Sifra and Sifri. Sifra is a book exclusively on the book of Vayikra and the Torah. Sifri is a book on the last two books, Bamidbar and Devarim of the Torah. And their purpose is Levair Ulahidia Ikri HaMishnah, to explain and to notify us of the sources of the Mishnah. The Mishnah was Rebbe's compilation of all the bottom line Oral Torah laws. But not many times does he reference the verses, almost never does he reference the verses on which they are based. Sifra and Sifri give us a link between the Mishnah and the Torah, the written Torah. So they teach us the sources of the Mishnah. For Rabbi Chia, who was another student of Rebbe, Chiber HaTosefta, he authored the work known as Tosefta. Tosefta means addition. It's many, many, many laws that were not, for whatever reason, preserved as part of the Mishnah, but they are Mishnaic teachings. That means they're teachings from the Torah sages of that time. They're called Tosefta, additions, Levair Inyanei HaMishnah, to explain the concepts discussed in the Mishnah further. V'chein Rabbi Hoshia bar Kapara, they also, these two sages, Chibru Braises, Levair Divrei HaMishnah, they also established, authored Braises. Braises means, again, outside. It's the same concept as Tosefta, additional Mishnaic teachings that didn't make it into the body of the Mishnah to explain the words of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan, who again was the youngest of Rabbeinu HaKadosh's students, Chiber HaGemara HaYerushalmis B'Eretz Yisrael, he authored what we know today as the Jerusalem Talmud in Israel, Achar Churban Abayis Bekiruv Shleish Mei Shana, about 300 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. The Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, was authored way before the Babylonian Talmud. In fact, many historians are of the opinion that the Jerusalem Talmud did not undergo as much redaction and editing as the Babylonian Talmud did, because it had to be written earlier because of the persecution that was going on in Israel at the time, and therefore it's much, much harder to learn it. You open up a page of Jerusalem Talmud, it's very cryptic relative to the Babylonian Talmud, which is much more elaborate, elucidated, and explained. Anyway, that was Rabbi Yochanan, who was the youngest of Rebbe's students. Continues the Rambam, page 25. Umigdolei hachachamim, he continues delineating the tradition, Shekiblu me Rav Shmuel. Now, Rav Shmuel marked a new era in Jewish study. Until now, all the sages were classified as Tanaim, authors of the Mishnah. They were Mishnaic sages. Rav and Shmuel began the period of Jewish history governed by the rabbis known as the Amoraim. Amoraim literally means translators or interpreters. They were the sages of the Talmud. And they began a period of Jewish history in Babylon. Now Jews left Israel mostly and were in Babylon. And this is where the major academies opened up in different cities of Surah and Naharda. And they taught and continued this unbroken chain of tradition. The greatest of the sages who were their students were Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda, Rav Nachman, Rav Kahana. Four primary Talmudic sages. Rabbi Yochanan was again Rav and Shmuel's contemporary, but he kept the Torah going in Israel, teaching the Jerusalem Talmud. He had some major students: Rabbi Bar Chana, Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi, Rabbi Dimi, Rabbi Ovin. Fascinatingly, you notice that these last sages are called Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi. The previous ones from Rav Shmuel are called Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda. The Talmud tells us that any sage who carried the name Rav as a prefix came from Babylonia. A sage who had Rabbi came from Israel. Anyway, the line continued. Among the sages who received the tradition from Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda, who were living in Babylon, was Rabbah and Rav Yosef. Again, two very famous figures in the Talmud. Among the sages who received from Rabbah and Rav Yosef was Abaye and Rava, also tremendously famous. If you learn Talmud, you see them every other page. Ushneim kiblu gam Rav Nachman, and these two sages, Abaye and Rava, in addition to receiving from Rabbah and Rav Yosef, also received from Rav Nachman, who was a student of Rav and Shmuel, so they kind of skipped a generation there. Umiklala chachamim shekiblu meRava, among the sages who received from Rava was Rav Ashi and Ravina. These two are known; they are credited with redacting the Talmud. Umar bar Rav Ashi, who is considered to be the final Amora, the last of the Talmudic sages, Kibel me'aviv, he received directly from his father, Rav Ashi, as well as Meravina. Nimza, says the Rambam, if we were to work this all backwards, everything I just gave you, Merav Ashi ad Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom, Arboim Deiros, there's 40 generations, as the Rambam goes on to list. And the number 40 is very, very apropos to the idea of Torah, as the Torah itself says in the end of the 40 years of the desert, that it took 40 years for the Jewish people to understand properly the wisdom of the Torah. 40 is associated with Torah. Torah was given for 40 days. There were 40 days before Moses got the first tablets, 40 days before Moses got the second tablets. Fascinatingly, the Rambam himself begins his book with a mem and ends it with a mem. The first letter and the last letter are both mem, 40, and the Rebbe talks about that as well, and we'll discuss that in a couple of days from now. Bottom line, 40 generations straight, from the end of the Talmudic era until the beginning of Moses receiving it on Mount Sinai. And here the Rambam just goes through all the names he gave us, but backwards. Ve'eluhein, these they are. Firstly, Rav Ashi, Mei Rava. The prefix Mei means from. So we're just going to read it through and understand that it means one got from the other. Rav Ashi got from Rava. Ve'Rava, Mei Rabba. Ve'Rabba, Mei Rav Huna. Ve'Rav Huna, he had two sets of teachers, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shmuel, they were all contemporaries. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Shimon Aviv, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel Aviv. That was Rabbi Gamliel the second. Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon Aviv. That's Rabbi Shimon the second. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel Azakin Aviv. Rabbi Gamliel Azakin, Rabbi Shimon Aviv. And here we go back to the stage of the pairs. Rabbi Shimon Mehil Aviv V'Shamai, from Hillel and Shammai. Hillel the Shammai, Mishmaya V'Avtalion, who were converts. Remember, Shmaya V'Avtalion, Mi Yehuda V'Shimon, Yehuda V'Shimon, Mi Yeshua ben Prache V'Nitai Harabeli, V'Yeshua V'Nitai, Mi Yosef ben Yezer, V'Yosef ben Yochanan, V'Yosef ben Yezer, V'Yosef ben Yochanan, Mi Antignes, Meshimon Atzadik, and here we reach the beginning of the Second Temple era. V'Shimon Atzadik, Mi Ezra, who lived through the Babylonian exile of 70 years. V'Ezra, Mi Baruch, who witnessed the destruction of the First Temple. U'Baruch mi Yirmiyah, here we go back to the era of the prophets. V'Yirmiyah mi Tzvanya, Tzvanya mi Chavakuk, V'Chavakuk mi Nachum, V'Nachum mi Yoel, and here we turn to page 27. V'Yoel mi Micha, Micha mi Yeshaya, V'Yeshaya mi Omis, V'Omis mi Hoshea, V'Hoshea mi Zechariah, Zechariah mi Yehoyada, V'Yehoyada mi Elisha, and here we come back to the earliest prophets, Elisha me Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu me Achia, who was present in the desert but only received from David HaMelech, Achia me David, David me Shmuel, Shmuel me Eli, Eli me Pinchas, and here we see the Rambam credits Pinchas me Yehoshua. Even though Yehoshua and Pinchas both received from Moshe, nevertheless Yehoshua became the primary teacher and Pinchas became his student. Yehoshua me Moshe Rabbeinu, or Moshe Rabbeinu got directly mi Pia Gvura, from the mouth of the strength, which means from the mouth of Hashem. Nimtza, the Rambam concludes for today's portion, Shekulam me Hashem Alekei Yisrael, that all of the Jewish people ultimately received the Torah from Hashem, the God of Israel. And tomorrow we will continue how, after the Talmudic era, the Torah continued to expand and why the Rambam saw necessary to formulate his work.